Thank you. I'll take one more, Ed, and then come back to you. Peter Smythe.
Yeah, I would echo Mark's question around Suffolk Police's intention, and that would just be good to have a little discussion on that. But also, could we ask the ICB to do some form of impact assessment on the urgent care hub as respect to community and primary care capacity and workload movement?
So I know I've got more hands, Ed, but can you take those three, please? And I do note I think it's very interesting, this piece about police and mental health. They should not be the first call out, but I think that's where they've sort of defaulted to, or have been defaulted to. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you. Some very, very good questions there. So on the breast cancer screening, I wasn't aware of that shift either, Sharon. So let me take that away and report back to this committee if that would be helpful. So that's news to me. On the, I think it's called right person, right care, right persons. This is the police issue. So it kind of almost feels that there's been a national conversation in the police sector around this, because I've seen articles in London. There's been changes, as we know, in Yorkshire and Humber, and now more recently potentially changes flagged in Suffolk. I haven't heard from Essex Constabulary on their plans. So it is a matter of concern and risk, Mark. So we're in conversation with the Constabulary around setting up a series of workshops in Suffolk to understand the issue and to ensure that if there is going to be any change, that it needs to be a very carefully managed transition. And we would want, obviously, to do the same in Essex if there were similar plans emerging there. I might want to bring in Richard, who is organising some work in this area, just to give his perspective too, if that's okay. Richard, do you want to just add to that?
Yeah, no, just briefly. So within Suffolk Constabulary are very keen to look to roll this out in a phased way from around November. So given that we are looking to hold a series of workshops over the summer between the partners affected, so ostensibly County Council, ourselves, District Councils, NSFT, but if any other partners are interested in that, do let me know, and we'll pick that up. I can see Leighton's got his hand up, so I might defer to Leighton on from an Essex perspective, as I'm not as clear that the Chief Constable is necessarily yet pushing to implement something this year, but equally would be happy to join in alongside the other two ICBs and other partners if there was something similar.
Leighton?
Thank you. I obviously can't comment for Suffolk, but there's no short-term aspiration for Essex Police to adopt that model. We're staying with our concern for welfare policy that outlines our response to mental health incidents. It's been agreed and in place for over a year now. The focus for us is around wait times and handover of 136. That's where our focus is with partners, not the response, so to speak. So no shift from Essex Police in the short term. I think we will watch with interest to see how it plays out, but we're quite happy with the response policy that we've already got in the work with partners.
Thank you. Can I come back to you, Ed?
Yeah, Kath, did you want to come in on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. Just to say, it's really early days. Humberside took around 3 years to implement this model. So I think what we need to do is to have some a sense of calmness about this. It is right that the police should not actually be picking up the responsibility for care, which is under the responsibility of health and social care. But equally, we also have to think about the scale of the impact and make sure that there's a safe transition. I'd also mention that this isn't all about mental health. So this is about welfare checks. So, for example, primary care will be affected if primary care make requests to the police for welfare checks. It's not all mental health. And I think the risk is this is being labelled as a mental health risk and issue. But actually, we need to see the whole scale of this in terms of any plans to implement this model. But with our police colleagues, actually, we just need to do this in partnership and ensure the right people get the right care at the right time from the right services. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ed, you've got still a couple of points to answer.
Yes, on the impact assessment, so the Urgent Care Hub will absolutely do that, Peter, if that's not already in train. So that's very important that work is done.
Thanks, Ed. Now, I've got some more hands for you, Ed. Okay. You didn't actually answer, Mark, on what do you think are the most significant risks facing the ICB. Then, in order that they went up, Nikki O'Shaughnessy and Ruth Fisherday. So, Nikki first.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that report, Ed. I just wanted to support and reinforce Sharon's point, because Sharon makes a really important point about tendering, and this is a levelling up issue. We know that there are the same services in tendering as that there are in Colchester, and Sharon's raised the example of breast screening, but actually I think we need to review what other services are not being delivered in tendering as well. Ed, and I don't want to add to your workload or your staff's workload, but I do think we need to understand what else isn't being delivered. We know that we have huge infrastructure issues in tendering. Very hard for families to get around. We know poverty is at a higher level there. So families are more likely not to take up those services or not be able to access those services. So I just wonder, in terms of doing a wider piece of work about what else can and can't be accessed in tendering, I think it's really important. We've always said through the Alliance that we need services based in tendering. We don't want services reaching into tendering. Tendering needs to be treated in the same way as other areas rather than an add-on, which it often feels like. Thank you.
Can I come to Ruth Fisherday? I know Sharon Alexander wants to come back in on that topic. Let's deal with Ruth first.
Hi, yes, I was almost about to put my hand down, but very small point. Just when we're discussing both the police and the urgent care, apologies, I can't remember what it's called now, but the community hub work, that we do think about all times, including out of hours, and the impact of ED. So if we're talking about ED, can we make sure that people from ED are in there? So it's about stakeholder representation in those conversations.
Thank you, Ruth. Sharon Alexander.
Thank you, Councillor Spence. The other issue that I needed to raise on the same type of topic is it's also the same for kidney dialysis. I've got another member of staff who's receiving dialysis treatment 3 times a week. We've got wonderful facilities at Kennedy Way, but it's oversubscribed and she's having to travel to Colchester. And you can imagine the distress caused there. Is there anything that can be done about that?
It does feel, Ed, I don't want to default to solutions, but we know deprivation has the greatest levels of deprivation. Tendering has the greatest levels of deprivation in the partnership. Actually, if I looked across Suffolk and Essex, and probably Norfolk, I think it's got the greatest levels. Shortest life expectancies, highest levels of mental illness, highest levels of disability of all the different sorts. And we know that access to facilities in the Robert Wood Johnson model has a role to play. Do you think, Ed, you might just think about whether you get to the point of having a specific conversation, meeting, discussion, whatever, about tendering and how we can bring in all the agencies beyond those in this call to have a joined up conversation. Housing's another point, but that's for the longer term. For the immediate, Ed, I come back to what Nikki said. And I think the other, and I've said to you about the key risks facing the ICP, I think the other bit I would say to you is 2 things. The community hubs model is much better established in Suffolk than it is in Essex as a whole. I know we have a very good one operating and tendering now. I would be grateful for the help of this ICS in trying to educate and socialise the advantages of that so that we might see it spread beyond this ICS. And secondly, I don't know who from SNE sits on the Essex Anchors board, Anchors Network board, chaired by Ian Davidson. But I am vocal in my view that brilliant the work it may do, we are scratching the surface of our opportunities where it comes to those with disabilities of all sorts and those who have had mental illness to gain employment. And when you try to get really meaningful management information, it is not great. So enough from me. Over to you, Ed.
My word, there's quite a few issues in there. So on tendering, absolutely delighted to pursue further conversations, as people now have been involved in bringing more services to tendering. I'm particularly interested in work in Harwich at the moment. So the more we can do, the better. And I fully recognise that transport is a huge blocker for people. So increasing services at Colchester is not necessarily a benefit for the people of tendering. So I'm very happy with that solution you proposed. On the community hub spreads, very happy to work with neighbouring ICBs on that. I'm a member of the Anchors Network, the Essex Anchors Network, so very happy to speak to Ian Davison about where we can progress that further. And then on Mark's risks, I guess the biggest one, a lot of this is driven by inequalities, isn't it? But workforce resilience and morale has got to be the biggest risk. The impact of long waits, whether it's in emergency departments or on elective lists, is clearly right up there. And then mental health, particularly in the context of children and young people, would be the third that I would reference. So those would be my three, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly to Laura Taylor-Green, and then I need to bring in Ewan Cameron. Laura?
Thank you, Councillor Spence. I'd just like to just add a bit more detail to the work that we'll be doing in tendering specifically. Following recent engagement with the Local Government Association and a series of workshops, the Alliance Committee has agreed to focus on developing place plans over the longer term. So recognising that we find solutions in the short term, they're very much concentrated on the next 3 years, focusing, as you said, on the Robert Wood Johnson model of socio-economic access and quality of healthcare, physical environment, including housing and health behaviours, and working with all partners to look at this. And the place plans will be led by a dedicated lead for tendering within the Alliance, and will support the ambitions and priorities within both the joint Essex Health and Wellbeing Strategy, the joint forward plan, and the core 20+5 groups that have been identified known to be more negatively impacted by health inequalities. And these plans will be starting that engagement very shortly. So I just thought I'd add a bit more detail to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And I would just say to your excellent Alliance partnership, I know you're doing great things. Always make sure that you take full use of those who can add power to your elbow. Okay. So between between SNE and between ECC and so on, we can totally support you and add help that will enable you to go faster and deeper. Can I just observe, Laura, because I've known you for a long time, everyone's calling me Councillor Spence. The people who are doctors are not being called doctors, and professors aren't being called professors. So John's much nicer for me, and it's only 4 letters instead of 16. Ewan Cameron.
Thank you, John. So perhaps if I give a quick update. So you'll all have heard the recent announcement on the prioritisation of the RAC hospitals. We've received funding to allow us to complete enabling works, which allow us to progress the fulfilment of the planning conditions that will allow us to commence construction. We've agreed heads of terms with a preferred partner for the creation of a compensatory environment and working on a design with statutory consultees such as Suffolk Wildlife Trust. Yeah. Our next steps include the design and building buffer planting, translocation of turf and archaeological surveys. We've received notification of additional funding to allow the development of both outline and full business cases, and we're currently working with the new hospital programme to engage the market in terms of the best method through which we can rapidly contract a construction partner. We're in the process of updating our strategic outline case, and we'll be seeking a refreshed letter of support from the ICB. Given that provision of utilities to new sites have very long lead times, we've engaged with UK Power Networks in planning the delivery of our calculated peak load, and initial responses have been positive. We've also mapped the process and dependencies for securing full planning permission, and the current plan is to secure this and the ability to commence construction by 2025. In terms of the clinical design of the building, we continue to work on how best to collaborate with partners in the system and where best to place services that are not required to be within acute hospital buildings. So happy to take any questions.
Well done, Ewan. Any questions of your own? No, thank you. That's great news, Ewan. Are you being in Harlow, where they've got the major funding, they're adopting the modular approach? Are you being asked to do that?
Yes, I think all of the rack replacements are using that method of construction.
Good. Well done. Thank you. Right, so we'll move on. That was a very good session. Thank you. We're going to move on to the Join Forward plan, which we've all talked about in different fora in many places already. Richard, the one critical question I have is there anything in this of substance that has changed from the last version we saw? Because if not, we can just nod it through.
Well, thank you for that introduction, John. You are right. We've seen this in a whole ream of different places, and hopefully that means that colleagues don't need me to spend an hour, which I was clearly planning to do, John, to go through it line by line. No, it's broadly the same.
Richard, it wouldn't have happened. It would not have happened.
It's hopefully self-explanatory. Effectively, where we've got to, I think, since the last time, John and colleagues, is we have now managed to agree collectively, I think, the kind of the 7 priorities. If you remember, we said we'd kind of land on a smaller number of top commitments that are in the exec summary in that nice figure. And what we've tried to do is then neatly set out, linking back to the key outcomes, the live well domains, what the specific priority is, and then importantly, what are the key indicators that we're going to hold ourselves accountable for as an ICB board for delivery over the next 5 years. So I would suggest that's the major change or finalisation since the last time the ICP saw it. And as Ed has said, thankfully it's now made its way through both health and wellbeing boards alongside the other ICB plans or where they got to, and our own ICB board, and was signed off by all 3. So we're now looking to finalise, just doing the kind of grammar, spell check, etc. And then we're looking to publish it later this month. And then you'll be glad to know we're moving into, which we already are anyway, delivery. We're just working through then a light touch approach, you'll be glad to know, monitoring over the year to see how we're actually doing through the ICB board. So I'll leave it there, John.
Thank you. Are there any questions which stand between members and their endorsement of the plan?
Yes, Nikki O'Shaughnessy and Mark Shenton.
Nikki and then Mark Shenton.
Thank you. Richard, relax. It's not to say that I'm not agreeing to the plan. It's a good plan, but of course it's 3 plans across each of the 3 alliances. So just from my perspective, having read it, how are we as an alliance going to reassure ourselves, and well, as an ICP, reassure ourselves that these plans are actually on track and that we are delivering? Because it's great about plans, but they are words. As you say, it's about delivery, it's about actions. So how will we assure ourselves that we are on track and delivering against the outcomes is my first question. And the second one is, how will success be shared? Because I think that's really important to know when things are working, but equally when things are going off track, whether that's through issues, blockages, how will we identify those and resolve them? So I just don't expect you to answer all of those, but I just think we need to have made sure that we've thought about those areas. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, even before you come to monitoring the alliance plans, Nikki, there's the question of the visibility of them. Mark, and then I'll come back to you, Richard.
Perhaps I'm going to answer Nikki's question. So I was just going to let members know that the Population Health Management team have been asked to look at how we bring together the linked data set that we now have and will have access to by the end of July. And bring that together with continuous quality improvement and the outcome-based accountability framework, and working with Susanna's team, so that we can have a method by which the ICP and the ICB can see how we're delivering against the outcomes that we have set. The best way of doing that is by being transparent and seeing where we're turning the curves, and if we're not turning them, why not? But also, as well as focusing on what's not going right, we've got a great opportunity to say what's going well and how to build on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Anything to add?
I'll just come back briefly on Nikki's point, John. So this is the ICB organisational plan, just to make a distinction from them, the 3 alliance delivery plans, which will be much broader in their scope, I think, as colleagues are aware, not just the kind of NHS aspect, but effectively all of the ICB partners at local places is work. So there is a correlation and a link between the two, but they are subtly different. Just briefly, in terms of the ICB monitoring, that's the point that we're just, as I mentioned earlier, that we're working through then, because I really don't want to create a whole onerous new regime. Really, this is about building on the infrastructure and governance that we've already got in place across the 3 alliances, and where appropriate, the theme-based committees like cancer. So happy to talk to you a little bit more, if helpful, alongside Laura on that. And celebrating success, yes, I think we need to do that throughout all of our partnerships around this document, because it is a compilation of all of you, actually, and many of you actually directly fed into what's within it. But we will be doing that through the board itself. I'm really key, as is Will and Ed, to have a showcase probably each or every second meeting at the board level, the public board, on an aspect of the JFP. So we actually hold ourselves accountable for its delivery and look at actually what's working and what's not. Last thing I'd say is this is an iterative document, so it's expected to be updated every year. So you thought you'd finish with it, so did I, but unfortunately we are going to be back this time next year with a further updated version showing how much we've delivered.
Well, that does remind me to think we all thought we'd finished with COVID vaccinations, but of course they continue. And so thank you, Richard. But just can we all please remember the take-up levels of the over 75 spring booster are not where we would want. I don't know what the Suffolk number is, but Essex is 55%, I gather. So do please, those people you know in those age groups, do please encourage them. Thank you, Richard. Are we content to endorse the joint forward plan?
Lots of nods. Yep.
There's lots of nodding going on, so that's fine. So now we come back. Sorry?
He said thank you.
Yeah. So now we come to a block of 4 papers to do with community. And I think the easiest thing if I hand over to Kirsten to be your compere for these items.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for providing us with 4 slots to talk about the voluntary sector today. All these papers relate to enabling the voluntary sector to be equal partners in the ICS. I think we're going to try and rattle through the first 3 a little bit so that we save time for the 4th one, which I think you'll probably want to discuss and comment on. But please don't let me put you off from asking questions or commenting on the other 3. So to start with, the first paper is about an event that took place in February, which was the Thinking Differently Together event, looking at the essential role of the voluntary sector in health and social care. A number of you will have attended that event. So the write-up talks about basically 2 neighbouring systems, which is Norfolk and Waveney and ourselves, SNE, working together to demonstrate the importance of the integration of the voluntary sector and partnership working from very different perspectives. So our system had a very newly set up assembly at that point, and the Norfolk and Waveney system had had an assembly established and running for about 18 months. The paper shows the reflections from Ed Garrett, Sue Cook and Tracy Bleakley, and lots of other examples of innovation and partnership working. And our agreed next steps were to continue to work together to deliver our collective ambitions, which are really about giving voice to local organisations, working with commissioners to look at longer term funding for the voluntary sector, continuing to collaborate and innovate, and really value the voluntary sector workforce. So the committee is really asked to receive this paper, but if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Any questions? Points?
Can't see any hands raised on that one.
So we received that paper. Kirsten, on you go.
Thank you, that's lovely. The next paper is a record of another meeting. It was a system learning event entitled A Community-Powered NHS with New Local, and it was chaired by Fanwell Matumbury, who will now present the paper to the committee. I'll hand over to Fanwell.
Thank you, Kirsten. So this is an event that took place on the 21st of April across the whole SNE system. And it was a very important event, and I think it ties in with some of the things that Kirsten has already talked about, particularly in terms of, how we work with our local communities. I co-chaired this event with Adam Lent, the chief executive of an organization called New Local. This is an independent think tank, which is sort of working with public services around how do we harness the power of community and allowing our communities to have a voice. Now, this is something that we've been talking about, quite a lot in our Thinking Differently events, but also particularly, post-pandemic and some of the things that we have seen. And we got to learn from, New Local, some of the initiatives that they've been doing across the country, which have been working very well. But I think the reflection on our part was that there's also quite a lot of positive things that we're doing in our local communities that we need to celebrate, also integrate into the way that we do things. So if you look at, some of the examples that, were presented on the day, and I'm great, Sharon Alexander is here. We talked about some of the good practice that is taking place in CVS tendering and using the asset-based community development approach and capitalizing on the local assets in the local area and trying to sort of bring in local communities and some initiatives that normally we wouldn't be looking at in terms of preventative services, but actually saying how do we turn wastelands into thriving, viable community spaces where people can come in and do community gardens and other things, and actually see the benefits in terms of how that prevents illness and other challenges that people experience. There were also other examples of good practice that were shared at the event. Looking at how particularly Suffolk County Council is working with local communities on the Collaborative Communities Board, but also some of the work that is happening in the maternity space and allowing, those people, sort of impacted by inequalities to inform the way our services were delivered. So I think that as a whole, we reflected on the fact that, very good work is happening. But I suppose the challenge is how do we turn this into an integrated approach where, these are not just pilots and the call to our public sector partners was that, we need mutual respect. We need to work, collaboratively as equal partners. Let's not just talk about it. Let's start to see, how that is actually happening in practice. And we need to explore more around information sharing and how, that is actually working, because there is a lot of information in local communities that we could all benefit from. So I think at the back of all this, it dovetails quite nicely with some of the things that Kirsten is going to talk about later around the resilience charter and the work that needs to happen. So, we're doing some very good work, but we need to continue in that thread and also, start to implement a lot of the recommendations. I'll stop there, Kirsten, and any questions?
Thank you, Manuel.
Any questions? I think, Kirsten, given the exemplary record of this ICS in community and voluntary sector engagement, how are you going to measure additionality? How are you going to be able to identify those things that happen because of this that would not have happened anyway?
That's a very good question, and I wonder if our next paper is going to shed some light on that, which is the quality development tool, which provides us with a baseline as such from the work that we've already done with it. But this is something that I hope that the alliances will be talking about as we go forward. When we raise the voluntary sector up to be an equal partner, it should be part of the agenda and the discussions at each alliance regularly. So hopefully that will help us there too.
Okay. Does nobody else carry on that? Sorry, Sharon.
Very quick answer to your question, Councillor John. There is a beneficiary at the Kennedy Way Community Garden who says he saved the NHS loads of dosh because he had a stroke and he was referred to Kennedy Way. He's met loads of friends. His daughter is desperate to put him in a home. Richard Watson met him, actually, and he has learnt new skills in the men's shed and built a shed for his garden with the help of other men. So I don't know if that's a case story that answers your question, but it's some anecdotal evidence from the outcomes that we measure.
I think it's probably, I would say it's an answer that endorses the point I was making. I've worked with men's sheds over 15 years now since they started, and they fulfil a brilliant purpose, particularly among newly retired men who don't have the social circles and need an activity. So, why will this? They're happening everywhere. Why would this make any difference? That's all. Anyway, thanks, Sharon. On we go, Kirsten.
Thank you very much, John. So the next paper is the Quality Development Tool, and that's being brought here to the committee to review. The Quality Development Tool is a tool that's been developed by NHS England, and Suffolk and North East Essex was one of the ICSs who put themselves forward to be part of a pilot to assess the efficacy of the tool, but also to gain insight from applying it, which I think might answer some of the questions raised before. So what the tool does is it assesses how well the voluntary sector is embedded in our system, and we used it as a snapshot to get a snapshot of our system over a period of about a month. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Rachel Jennings, who will be able to talk us through the tool and the results for Suffolk and North East Essex.
Thank you, Kirsten. Kathy, if you can just share the slides, please. We'll be really brief on these. And actually, you can move to the second slide if that's okay. So whilst that's just waiting to move through, there we go. Thank you. So as Kirsten said, it's currently in the pilot phase of running this toolkit, but we decided to put ourselves forward. And one of the reasons is we felt it really works well with the other work we're doing around the Resilience Charter, in the sense that it gives us that kind of snapshot baseline of where we currently are. We completed this across the 3 alliances. That worked very well in terms of acknowledging that some alliances are more progressed in some areas than others. Just to briefly go through those, as you can see, we had 6 areas. There's a total of 9 questions. I think the thing which came through is that in terms of that first area, with the voluntary sector being well embedded, or more established, that's certainly where the system is certainly more progressed in that area. We were looking at things around there, such as do we have voluntary sector representation in our committees, within our alliances? Do we have voting rights within the ICB and areas like that? As you can see, areas where perhaps we need to progress more, particularly around the data and intelligence. That was very much acknowledging around the capacity and the resource within the voluntary sector to be able to do this work, and also areas around the wider determinants of health. Again, certain areas where we know there's more to do to progress this. I think one of the other things which we talked about is in all of these categories, there's work that's already happening. But what was really great is, as alliances, everyone has really set the bar really high here in terms of saying, well, just because we have 1 or 2 organisations, voluntary sector groups involved in this, that isn't enough for us. We want to see that this is consistent, that it's embedded across the system, and also having that recognition of what does that mean for the smaller organisations? How do we ensure that they are also involved whilst acknowledging the resource and capacity challenges there might be? We just move to the final slide, please. So the key points we've picked up is that when we fed this back to the consultancies who are running this, it is a pilot. And what we said is we find it helpful as a development tool. We wouldn't want this to be a framework which is being mandated and measured and used to compare systems, but actually to be able to use it to develop and to have those conversations. It's very helpful. All 3 alliances said they're really keen to adopt this. They felt that it should be reviewed periodically, probably carried out on a quarterly basis. And I guess that's the summary, really. I mean, there's more which we can talk about there. You know, we had quite a short window of time to do this. So we said, again, going forwards, when the alliances have got more time to plan it, they would like to have even more stakeholders involved. But as a mechanism to be able to capture where work is going well and to be able to use it to set actions to review on a periodic basis, it felt that it was a good tool, and we fed that back to NHSE. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions on that? Thanks, Rachel. Questions on that?
Mark Shenton.
No.
Mark Shenton.
Oh, Mark.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for those presentations. I know that the integrated neighbourhood teams, their core leadership teams, are very interested in how they work with their communities, and in particular the Connect, as it's known in Suffolk, which is our district and borough councils, the community assets, the voluntary community enterprise and faith sector, and how they do that well. And I think this development tool would help them. So not just alliances in doing that. So thank you.
Thank you. Nikki, shall I say before I go back to Rachel?
Thank you. So I think it is a helpful tool. I think we have to be realistic, and I do think we need to keep the VCSE close to us in terms of what their view is. So whilst we might think we're making progress and we recognise there is work to do, what is the experience of the VCSE in that? And the other point for me is, can we benchmark against what others are doing? So, is there any learning out there for us in terms of success that we can think about how we utilise that within SNE? Thank you.
Anybody else?
No, there are other hands up at the moment.
Rachel, back to you.
Thank you. On the point, Mark, around Connect, they were referenced a lot when the alliances were talking about where work is going well. Connect were referenced a lot in those conversations. I think there's other points as well, Nikki, that you've made. Yeah, absolutely. The voluntary sector were involved in this, and so where we were sometimes pushed for time, and we did it different per each alliance. But so, for example, for North East Essex, we had our infrastructures during those conversations, working alongside the VCSE lead within the ICB. Also, I guess the other point is, because this is led by NHSE, they're looking at this from an ICB perspective, but we tried to take more of a system-wide approach because we felt that that's the way we work in SNE, and we felt that that added the most benefit. So, for example, it was very much dependent on time, but where we were doing it in Ipswich and East, we were able to also involve some of our other providers, and we had public health involved. So the alliances are really clear on how they think they can take this forward and add value, and I think it's really helpful for them to be able to kind of progress that. But as you say, the other bit around linking up and sharing good practice within our system, but also more widely is a key point on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's exhausted that discussion. I just find it quite interesting, if I have a couple of thoughts. They're not criticisms, they're thoughts. Firstly, we often talk about the voluntary community faith sectors as them. We've done it twice or three times today, actually. I regard myself as VCS because I'm a current or past trustee of 4 major charities in this county, quite apart from being chair or president of a range of national ones. The we is still, if I'm talking about that sector, it's still we to me. So what we're talking about here, Kirsten, always is the bit about the structural bit, how we ensure that the organisations that represent the sector can fully come to the table and play as equal parts. And on this equal partnership, what I note is that many of the organisations with which I am or have been involved go down the route of more and more reliance on providers like county councils, local councils and so on. And it becomes very difficult if you're a subcontractor to be able to claim equal partnership, because ultimately the contractor who awards the contract has a leverage that you don't have in return. And I just raise it as a dilemma in my mind. that cannot be avoided when that sort of relationship's in place. It's not for today. It's just a philosophical thought from an old man. So, Kirsten, we come to the main paper.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, that's right. And I think possibly some of your comments will be sort of pointed out in the main paper, but not resolved, unfortunately. But that's, as you say, for the future. This main paper is the Resilience Charter, and it provides a summary of work which has been completed in co-design with system partners to develop our Resilience Charter. And the committee's asked to approve this report at the end of our presentation. So as background, before I hand over to Rachel, I think you'll remember that the original Resilience Charter came to the ICP, or I think it might have even been its precursor committee a couple of years ago, and was approved. However, it was more difficult to embed the Charter than we had anticipated, and system partners fed back to us that they felt this would be resolved by a piece of co-production, which this committee approved in January this year. So since that time, work has gone on over the last few months, led by Rachel Jennings, to co-design and develop the new Charter principles. And I'll hand over to Rachel so that she can talk us through them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And Kathy, if you don't mind putting the slides up, please. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So thank you, Kirsten. So just to give a summary, I think colleagues are aware of this, but in terms of that process, we started back in February with an online survey. We've done 2 system workshops, and we've also run a series of task and finish groups. We had 5 groups overall, and we concluded with a system workshop at the end of May. I'll just briefly sort of cover off around the engagement, because I think that's really important. What we found, as Kirsten said, with that the original charter, is that perhaps we hadn't had as much engagement as would be helpful to ensure that we could embed the principles. So as you can see, we've had good engagement, 110 people, and we spent a lot of time when we was looking at this from the task and finish groups, as well about making sure we had really good representation from our Essex colleagues as well as Suffolk, and also looking at voluntary sector and statutory sector. So overall, we're very happy with the number of people who've been involved. Next slide, please. This next slide gives a summary of our statutory and voluntary sector partners. And given that it was quite in some ways, some people still felt it was quite a short time frame, and due to system pressures, we're really pleased with how many people could take part. I guess the point which I want to pick up on that bottom table in that very last box is, as you can see, we've had really good engagement from the voluntary sector, but we've been really mindful of those challenges that might affect some of our smaller organisations, and how could we still ensure that they engaged. So we're particularly, very thankful to our 3 local infrastructure organisations, CAS, CVST, and C360, who use their networks to reach a wider audience through Tendering Together, One Colchester, different funding networks, etc. We also shared this through the VCFSE Assembly and also through the Collaborative Communities Board. So we're quite happy with the number of organisations who have been involved. Next slide, please. So before we go into the principles, just to cover off a couple of key points. So the principles, the language, the detail in them, this has very much been co-designed from all of our engagement activities. They're based on we statements. Some of the feedback was around the previous principles. Perhaps it was more directed at the statutory sector in terms of what they needed to do, and that didn't feel in the spirit of the collaboration that we want here. So it's very much we statements. It was agreed that these need to be iterative and reviewed periodically, because as the relationships develop, there will be new focus and more activity we need to do. They're currently numbered. It isn't to signify the importance. It's just whilst we're still in this sort of draft, in case anyone wants to feedback specifically. And I guess the final point just added more recently is that sometimes when we were doing the engagement, there was feedback saying, well, what about our communities? We haven't involved them and they're not being referenced enough in the principles. And it was just sort of pointing out that it in no way takes away from the importance there is of co-designing with our communities. But this was specifically about how do we embed the voluntary sector within the system as equal partners. And so that's what that focus is. But of course, by embedding these principles, arguably, we then have the stronger foundations for how we work with our communities. Next slide, please. So it does look like a little bit of a busy slide, but we wanted to have all 8 principles on the one slide. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple of the key points here. So the first one here is around equal partners. We had a task and finish group, which specifically looked at trust and culture, but unsurprisingly, values, principles is something which came through on all of our conversations. I think some of the things we want to pick out here is acknowledging that there are differences between the sectors, but there are those shared values and principles. The second one, and this was very important, which came through so much, was around honest, open communication and transparency. And that's from whether we're looking at commissioning, whether we're looking at monitoring, evaluation, all of those things, having that open and honest and transparent conversation. The third one is around working collaboratively. I think some of the points which came up from here is from the voluntary sector saying, well, sometimes we feel like, you know, we're thought of in terms of the voluntary sector are there to be able to respond to crisis, and absolutely, you know, very much able to do that. But actually, there's more to it than that, and really wanting to have the voluntary sector involved in that early stages as possible, and in terms of the strategic planning, and particularly when we look at areas around prevention. The fourth one was looking around collaboration and co-design. Again, we had a co-design task and finish group, but co-design came through in so many of the activities, just acknowledging the importance that there is, and really stressing about how we co-design at the very earliest stage, and looking at the value that those partnerships and that knowledge brings to innovation and maximising resources. The fifth one is around the diversity of the sector. Again, that acknowledgement of the size and scale of the sector and the different organisations, being mindful of the resource and capacity challenges, which affects very much the grassroots organisations, but equally our medium and larger providers too. Then we look around streamlining processes. So this one came up a lot, again, when we was looking around funding, monitoring and evaluation. The key things here is around proportionality and ensuring whatever those processes are proportionate to the work that's being done, and that it's being led by the outcomes we're seeking to achieve. The seventh one, you know, this unsurprisingly, there was a lot we wanted to focus and cover off around funding. I think everyone is aware of the challenges there are around that non-recurrent funding. It's really important that we stressed around the impact that has not only on the services and interventions and the sustainability of those, but of course the voluntary sector, and how that insecurity impacts how they can attract and retain their staff as well. What we talked around that is around using the range of funding mechanisms, acknowledging that wanting to move to that longest funding is certainly a priority, but acknowledging that those smaller grants do have a place as well. What we talked a lot around here is around what powers we have as a system, how we can influence the environment that we operate in, whereas fed back so much around a lot of what our statutory partners have to work in is very much led by national directive, but what can we do on a local level to try and influence that environment? And the final one is around the one workforce. There was lots we had in our previous principles, which was specifically looking at certain aspects of training, back office support. We wanted to kind of incorporate that in one activity. We've talked a lot around the one workforce and how that is that route to be able to address things around training and building the resilience and capacity of the voluntary sector. If we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to try and be really quick. We had 5 task and finish groups. So all of these papers all of this information is in the papers. So just really briefly on the sustainable funding, you'll notice that each group had joint SROs. So it's worth noting that we made sure we had a representative from the voluntary sector and also one from the statutory partners as well. Within sustainable funding, what we found with that group, we were able to bring together such a diverse number of experiences. So we had our procurement leads within statutory partners, we had our executive director of finance, but we also then had them working alongside our community foundations, the National Lottery Community Fund, our voluntary sector organisations, our infrastructure groups, and that insight was really powerful to be able to look at ways that we want to progress this work. They came forward with some recommendations and felt that actually there is some benefit to this group actually continuing to progress work, specifically looking at a good practice guide, looking around embedding social value and also around that streamlining processes. So that's one of the things which we'd like to get approval for. And also just picking up again around that the challenges of non-recurrent funding, and how the Hewitt review did make the recommendations as well about the end of small in-year funding pots, and really trying to see how we can progress that on a local level. Next slide, please. So the next slide was around trust and culture. I think the point to pick up on here in the recommendations around how we can have more joined up training. We talked about the one team training and how that's been a really good example of that joined up approach of different system partners all coming together to work on training. We also talked about the importance of progressing mentoring secondments and employer supported volunteering. Next slide, please. The next slide was around co-production. As we've said, co-production was so important and picked up in all of the groups. Some of the things we talked about here is about how do we have a joined up approach and how do we share the learning across the system. And we was talking about how the work of the co-production hub in the ICA can help with that work. Next slide, please. And then the final group was around quality and monitoring. This was where we was talking about having that proportionate approach to how we monitor. I think some of the key things which came up here is around that importance of qualitative feedback. I think that's come through on some of those previous presentations. We're really keen to see how we can progress that as a system. There seems to be more focus historically around that qualitative, and we're trying to see quantitative, and try and see how we can progress that more around that qualitative as well, and ensure that that has that equals value. We also talked around here around how our local infrastructures do lots of work already around health checks for the resilience of of our voluntary sector, and how we can expand on some of that work as well. Thank you. Next slide.
Just got many more.
Next slide was around resilience and capacity. So very briefly, this is where we want to move this work forward under the One Workforce Principles and through the People Committee. So the recommendations we've made there would be taken to the People Committee. And then we're now going to move to the conclusions, which Kirsten, you will be able to pick up on.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Next slide, please. It's coming.
It's not moving on. I'll try and just move on.
That's okay. While we're waiting, just to say there's an awful lot of work that's been done there with a lot of involvement from both the statutory sector and voluntary sector. And I think the thing we really need to do now is to make sure this happens. I know everyone's very enthusiastic about this and very positive and behind it, but it's about now, how do we make this continue? How does it happen? So that's really what the committee is asked to approve today. It's asked to approve the charter principles themselves, but we want all system partners to approve it. And then what we'd really like is for the ICP co-chairs and myself as voluntary sector assembly chair to sign the charter on behalf of the whole system. So that's the first point that we'd like approved. The second point for approval is about what we want to do next, the next stages of work. And how we want to progress. And the recommendations includes some of the stuff that Rachel's already covered, which is about continuing the sustainable funding task and finish group and progressing the ICS measurement framework and various other of the recommendations within the paper. The third thing that the committee is asked to approve is the incorporation of the new charter principles and best practice case studies within the Suffolk and North East Essex integrated care strategy, which you know is available on the ICS website. And the final thing is that we would like to come back to this committee in December and ask that the committee agree to receive a further update on progress then. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot of hands up and not too much time. So if I could ask people to come straight to your point. First, Ruth Fishery, please.
Yeah, I think the ideal would be that this is embedded, so we don't need to discuss this going forward. Wouldn't that be a really amazing place to get to? But the commitment of principles have been discussed many times, and I think that my 2 points is, one is, are there some permanent barriers that are actually genuinely going to stop us achieving some of this? And if there aren't, I mean, I think having a review in 6 months would be fantastic, but why are we not making progress with this? Why in the last 4 years that I've been involved in the system have we not actually done more? So it seems to me that there are some maybe hidden or undisclosed barriers which are actually stopping this happen, because this is, the words are absolutely right, but not being said again and again.
Now that's very important. I would normally be doing this in groups of 3 points. But it seems to me, Kirsten, that's a very important one. How satisfied are we that there are not some hidden barriers that are really immovable? And if they're going to be hard, how are we going to identify them?
I think that's a really good question. I think we've identified 2 of the barriers within the work that took place in the task and finish groups. A really key barrier before has been the trust and culture issue, and actually exposing that and having the conversations about that has taken us a step further to being able to really embed this. And the other issue, John, is one that you picked up on before we came to this paper, which is about the funding and the relative levels of power that you have in a relationship of contract, and when you get involved with being able to talk about what's being contracted and various other aspects to do with that. And again, having the conversation with the right people around the table, I think, has really started this. It will enable us to progress. We'll have to keep an eye on it. That's why it's so vital, I think, that the Sustainable Funding Task and Finish group continues, so that we can, continue to have the right people making progress. We will have to keep an eye on it to see if there's anything else that we haven't anticipated as a barrier that comes forward. But those 2 key things, I think, are in the plan to address.
Thank you. Excellent question. Thank you. Let me go to Molly, then Ed, then Charlotte. Molly.
Thank you, John. And good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm a consultant in public health at the County Council in Suffolk and representing Stuart Keeble today. Thank you, Kirsten and Rachel, for those excellent presentations. We have just really one main question from our team. So for us in Suffolk, the relationship between our district and boroughs and the VCFSE is a really key element to enable us to take the work forward. Are there plans to help the district and boroughs adopt the charter specifically, potentially through the Collaborative Communities Board? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ed?
I was going to make the same question around district and borough leadership of this and ownership, but other than that, I just want to verbalise my support. It's a fantastic piece of work, and as I said in the chat, I think Rachel is doing a brilliant job behind the scenes, bringing this together with other partners, so thank you.
Okay, Charlotte?
Yeah, thank you, John. For those that don't know me, I'm Charlotte Britton, so I'm here on behalf of Lucy Whiteman, Director of Public Health at Essex. And just to say, we're supportive of the principles within this. We've been part of this review and leading one of the task and finish groups. I think the power is in the collaboration, and I think many of you might know that we're doing a piece of work at the moment about our investment into the voluntary sector through our commitment to our infrastructure partners and trying to give that sustainability to that funding. And I think there is a lot of power in being able to deliver these principles through collaborative working around infrastructure. So be really interested in having conversations with the right people around how do we co-invest into those partners to enable us to deliver the ambitions that have come out of this resilience charter. And they, sort of like mirror obviously the ambitions of ECC in this space and my team within strengthening community. So really happy to put that offer out there and to start that conversation.
Thank you. Will Pope?
Thank you, John. And I would like to make 2 points, if I may. The first one is the general response to the point about why isn't this fully embedded? Why aren't we doing it already? And or that point, that if you like, the impatience for progress point, totally sympathetic to that, completely support it. But I don't think we should be surprised that this will still be a journey. and therefore progress will be step by step. And this is if you like, the first step. It's not even the first we've taken, is it, over the years, but this is a very important step. But not to be surprised that we will need to report back. There will be corrections to be made. There will be learnings from it. And so I think the process as proposed is absolutely right. And the second point, John, is totally supportive of it in every way. Very happy to sign it from my point of view in the way proposed. Thank you.
Well, I'll come back on the back of that in a second, but Tara?
Thank you. Just to further some of Will's comments, absolutely, I think, it is a journey, and it's certainly been a journey from the start of the Resilience Charter to this point. And on Ruth, your points regarding, the challenges in embedding something, a culture change takes so long, and I think the voluntary sector is so diverse and comes from such a place where it's been seen or feels it has been seen as an unequal partner. So getting to a place where we've got an equitable place to deliver services is really, really key. I just wanted to lean towards the quality development tool, which has been so important, and actually it was brilliant to be involved in that and to see some of the changes or the difference of views from different partners and in the different alliances as well. And I think it's going to be really key moving forward as we keep the resilience principles key to look at how we can use the quality development tool to measure how far we have got with this and to recognise some of the challenges and to keep the resilience principles, as a live thing, to be changing it in relation to how we're seeing things moving with the quality development tool.
Thank you. Nikki O'Shaughnessy?
Thank you. I just wanted to make the point that the VCFSE is crucial to our success. This is about early help, it's about preventative work, and we have to invest. They are the backbone in supporting us moving forward. So I am absolutely in support of the principles of the Charter. It is a really good piece of work. We know, I'm very sad about what Ruth has said, because obviously I haven't been close to the journey over the last 4 years, but recognising that we probably do need to keep it very close to us as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I think I've gone through all the...
Tracy Rudling.
Tracy?
Hello, yes, I think this piece of work has been excellent. As you say, it's been a bit of a journey. It's been a long time coming. I think from our perspective, it's about now our leadership taking this back into place. So for me, my role as a leader of Infrastructure Agency in Colchester, the embedding part is for me to take that back now through One Colchester, which is a collaboration not only of the voluntary sector, but it is about the city council, but also our businesses, which again have a part to play in this. So for me, my role here now is to take this back, seek the approval here, but also take that back to place where it then gets embedded on the ground and then comes up from there.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Again, it's similar to the point Will made, but I'll come back. Mark Shenton, and then I think I'll try to draw things together.
Thank you, John. Just to say, deeds, not words. We've heard the words are right. We now have to do the deeds. And just wanted to say, thank you for the reference to the One Team programme. Its ethos is about building the culture through learning together in real work and being able to see the strengths that everyone brings to the table and how by working together they can create what we really want to see delivered in this charter. So thank you.
Thank you. Melanie, you've just put your hand up. Is it a new point, Melanie?
I'd like to amplify someone's point, if I may.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to just say I really support the Charter and thank you to SNE for taking the time to focus on this. I'm really glad that Tracy called out and mentioned business, because I think when we talk about VCSE, what isn't always front and centre is the links that VCSE have, which is different to what the public sector, parts of the public sector have with business, and how we can use that link and those relationships we have, which are really strong relationships, to leverage
both funding but also community action. So, and I think that just talking about VCSE sometimes that point around and you can get to businesses through VCSE isn't always front and centre. So thank you for raising that, Tracy.
And thank you for raising that, Melanie. Absolutely right. And I want to make us want me to say a picky thing, and then I'll make the bigger piece. I don't sign. You're going to ask Will and Andrew and I to sign this document, and I don't sign documents unless I'm clear from my officers that that is the right thing to do. So I reached out to them, and it was interesting actually. There would be a sense, Kirsten, that while there has been very good engagement with Essex organisations based in the SNE area, there has maybe been less with Essex-wide organisations beyond the SNE area, but which still operate within it. So I'd just like you to, in the next steps, pick that up. And in particular, and you may know if I declare in this my involvement in the Church of England, I haven't found, and nor is it evidenced here, anyone in the Essex Faith Covenant movement that seems to know much about it. So I'd be grateful if you would pick that up. But the officers have recommended that Essex County Council sign it. Will's already told us he is willing to do so. And I'm about to ask somebody from Suffolk County Council. I don't think Andrew's here, is he? Is there a senior person in the County Council that's going to commit? No.
It's Molly. Yeah, Molly.
Molly?
She'll mute. You're on mute, Molly.
Apologies for that. Yes. So on behalf of Stuart Keeble, absolutely, we do approve. Yeah.
Okay. I had quite a bit of people saying, why aren't we just doing it? Actually, from my perspective, sitting on the outside, we are doing it. You know, we may not have signed it and we may agree there's more work to do. But from what one witnesses, many aspects of this are coming into being already and moving forward. So just as I said, there's no such thing as a separate world called the community voluntary sector. So there is nothing that's completely separate called being an existing state and getting going. So I think, Kirsten, you have a pretty clear route. Are you content to move to are you happy to do one vote on all aspects of this?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So can we please really, with vigour and acclaim, signal our agreement to the Resilience Charter and to the various actions following thereafter?
Hands up for me.
Good, thank you. And Kirsten, to you and everybody involved, our warmest thanks for all that you have done and will continue to do. Really.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to effectively the closing report from the Community Ambitions Programme. And I've just forgotten who's doing it. Sharon, you're going to do this at the end of a good piece of work.
I am, and I appreciate that we're running short of time, we're running behind, so I'll try and be as quick as I can. So Kathy's going to kindly share some slides. Appreciate that the report was a long report, mainly due to the appendices. The main report was relatively short, I hope. But really, I think that's because what I would like you to do is cascade to colleagues if you can. The other thing I just wanted to say up front was that Edward Creasy, who chaired the Task and Finish group, was hoping to be here today, but he sent his apologies. So at the end of these slides, I've got some comments from him to share with you today. So next slide, please. I think, or maybe it's not moving on, Kathy. I'll carry on because we're short of time.
but hopefully she'll be able to move us on. I just wanted to give a brief reminder that, there we are. So a brief reminder that this programme was in the context of the learning from COVID, that we need to think not just about the majority, but about the few, our minorities in our communities, and also the context of the What Are We Missing initiative, and Fanwell, who's heavily involved, is here today. And those issues informed the co-production of the Community Ambition programme, which focused on ethnic minorities and deprivation. We co-produced that scope of that programme. The co-production told us that we need to listen, learn, ensure representation from diverse communities, develop culturally competent services, and invest more and wisely. And we aim to embed those organisations that we partnered with in the end in the health and care system by raising their profile, by building relationships. I can hear a thing in the background somewhere. I'm not sure what that is.
They then look on the system and say yes.
Anyway, I'll carry on. Building relationships, raising these organisations' profile by building relationships with the system, helping the system see the value of those organisations, and encouraging investment. And I think we've been successful in part in that. So that 2-year programme ran until the end of May, so it is now finished last week before. Next slide, please. The various projects worked with individuals, families, and whole communities across the age groups, across ethnicities. They help people to live healthier lives, access services, manage socio-economic challenges, and help people support each other. They asked their communities what they needed. They asked them about the difficulties they face and how services could better meet their needs. And just to highlight, there were around 2,000 direct beneficiaries, over 600 indirect beneficiaries, but I would say that that was the number that the projects named, but actually I think that ripple effect extended throughout whole communities as well. Next slide, please. Our projects learned how a number of things. They learnt how trust and relationships are crucial. That's trust and relationships with their communities and with services, crucial to linking those people to services, to understanding what support people needed from them and from statutory services, and the importance of adaptability so that they could empower people and demonstrate their allyship. And the system also learned. We learned about the value of co-production, of the expertise in communities that we needed to draw on, and how we needed to build trust with communities. We need to enable those organisations to have the right resources, and we need to enable them to grow from their grassroots. Next slide. So we first highlighted the achievements of the projects to the ICS board actually this time last year, the June ICS board, and also the strategic investment group that ran at that time, obviously before the new arrangements, and that was at the end of year 1 of the programme. And we also highlighted from then the need to start planning for the sustainability of these projects. As the end of year 2 approached, however, there was still uncertainty about what support was going to be available going forward. So the issue was brought, if you remember, to the ICP committee in March, and a task and finish group was agreed to be created to consider how we would take our learning and embed it, how we would extend ways of working, and that's through co-production and that targeted investment we talked about, we have been talking about for a long time, and also looking at further opportunities to invest in these projects, whether that's finance or support or resources. The group met twice. It had representation from NHS commissioners and providers in the relevant programme areas, from local authorities and the VCFSE. There were offers of practical support, a lot from the alliances. There were offers to build further relationships. Top of my head, that includes, EPUT, that includes CVS tendering, Sharon's here today. In terms of funding, some projects already had part of their work further funded, particularly maternity, which is doing great work, but also other projects. So The cancer programme has funded a connector to help increase uptake of cancer screening and tendering and other areas. But much of the work, and I'm thinking about the work with refugees and peer support, children and families work in Newmarket, Black men's mental health in Colchester, community work with Bangladeshis in Colchester and Tendring, and the development generally of culturally competent services. That reduces and some cases stops now. It was identified in terms of funding that future funding may become available, but that's not certain, and it looks like anything that is available might be short term as it stands at the moment. There is health inequalities funding being planned, but that's at its early stage of development with the ICB committee. And next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight when we can get that coming forward, that there are some comments from the chair of the committee. Oh, there we are. Lovely. Thank you, Kathy. Edward, as I said, couldn't be here today, but he did share some comments. So he commented that the original grants made to the charities have had a significantly beneficial impact across those communities that they support. The Task and Finish group was able to identify several pathways for non-financial support. The issue of financial constraint is very prevalent, and obviously those financial challenges that are around for everybody are fully recognised. Securing sustainable financial support, however, is far and away the greatest priority for all of the grassroots organisations and the people and communities they serve. Otherwise, there is a risk of short-term success becoming long-term frustration and failure. And with the ending of the programme, much of the valuable project work will cease, and this places many of their achievements at risk. So absolutely, we recognise those challenges. Just to summarise, without that support, including funding, and to be honest, these groups are not asking for large amounts. They're thousands, some of them tens of thousands, but nothing more. We risk losing those achievements. I think we also fail in part in those aims that we originally had to listen, to learn, to be allies, and to invest differently. And I don't know if Dean Dorset's here today, but he for years has been talking about that. We risk losing the trust of those groups and communities. We lose their voice potentially, at least in part, and their expertise. And bear in mind, these are when I was in the local authority, we used to call them user-led groups, but community-led groups who are part of and represent their communities, and also those other groups that have been involved who are their allies. We risk failing in part in our aims to enable those organisations to flourish and better serve their communities, and as we've talked about just a few minutes ago, become equal partners. So the committee is asked to receive the report, approve the Task and Finish group conclusions, that some groups have had further funding, but there's not a lot further funding to continue much of the work, although there may be possibilities. We ask the committee to consider the offers in the paper. Are there more offers? Is there more options, further options that we could consider? But I would also, link this to the discussion we've had on the VCFSE Charter today around equality, respect, sharing knowledge and expertise, that stuff around the diversity of the sector and the challenges of short-term funding, which, the principles highlight just there. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. We'll need to keep the conversation. Just bear in mind everything. This is important. We're being asked to receive the final reports and to note the comments. We will be resuming after the break at 11:10. Shane?
Thank you, Chairman. It's an excellent report. Thank you very much, Sharon. Lots and lots of great detail in there. 1 point and 1 question. So the point is the value for money of this investment seems quite high. So by my brief calculation, there's over 3,500 direct and indirect beneficiaries of this investment for just under £500,000. That's a cost of about £124 per beneficiary, assuming it was evenly spread, which I know it's not, which is not bad value for money in terms of the outcomes that are being reported here. So really, really good piece of work. NHS Charities Together looks like its momentum continues, and there may well be further funding coming through that route. And I guess the question for this board is whether we would continue to prioritise this as a use for funding if it came down that way.
Too big a debate to get involved in today, Shane. I'm not sure it is for us to say anyway, in a way. But what we can do is try to make sure that these organisations know the wide variety of funding streams available. I don't know, Melanie, where you are in Suffolk, but the biggest distributor of funds of this sort in Essex is the Community Foundation. Nothing to do with the council, but actually with those very good links with business that you talked about, Melanie. We have the Essex Community Initiatives Fund, the Essex Locality Fund, what's the other one? The Accelerator Fund will be coming forward in due course. I say, there are so many funding sources, we must not always assume it is from within the people around this table that the funding has to flow. And this particular sum was always one-off short-term money. We do know that. Next, any more hands up?
Nikki.
Nikki, you're trying to say?
Thank you. I just want to say that the report recognises health inequalities and historical entrenched institutional discrimination is what's referred to, faced by people from minority ethnic groups. But the ICS has pledged to bring about change to Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, yet we don't actually name racism, and our aspiration to be anti-racist in our approach, given that we live in a society that privileges white people. So there's something for me about naming it, because race is often diluted and lost amongst other forms of oppression and disadvantage. And this is a big issue that we are grappling and working in within Essex Children and Family Service. I think it's very sad that potentially some of these very successful projects will now have to end. And I think the issue that we need to be considering outside of this forum, this meeting, is actually from the onset of supporting these projects, how do we consider and how do they consider their own sustainability from start to finish? Especially obviously where there is clear evidence of impact and outcome. So that's something that we've got to be thinking about from the earliest moment, because actually we set people up to fail, don't we, otherwise, at the end of that period of time, whether that's 1 year, 2 years or whatever. So we've got to be thinking about that sort of immediately. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. And the right piece is how do we help them? They have to be the people who consider sustainability. How do we help them do it when they're so hard pushed for capacity? Melanie, you've taken my cue.
I thought I would come in with that cue. Thank you, John. To say, yes, we work in the very same way as Essex Community Foundation. We work closely with them as well on all of those different funding streams, from businesses particularly, and from private donors as well, and from national trusts that come in. And it's a way that we can get it out to the voluntary sector very quickly. I have to say, having worked all of my career in the NHS, this part of funding and also the will and the desire from other sectors to make a difference, it was very hidden to me, John, previously. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that was working in the NHS that it was hidden from. So I think it's really important to have that in mind. There are different funding sources and different streams and activities all trying to make a difference out there.
Thank you. We're on the piece of receiving this report. Sharon, any last very brief word from you?
Chris Abraham there.
Oh, sorry, Chris Abraham's been. Can you please be brief, Chris? You're down to 6 minutes of a break now.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Thanks, John and Nikki. I'm just responding to your point. I think this is where infrastructure organisations can really come in and support, offering sort of more sort of advice around financial strategies and business planning for some of those organisations that perhaps around future funding, it helps build their capacity and their sustainability. And I'm sure CBST, Culture 360 and CAS will be very happy to help those groups.
Sharon, last sentence.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. Just to say, NHS Charities Together have not offered us any further funding at this stage. The organisations, most of them are aware of the foundations and I think have starting to build relationships with them. Any offers of support, particularly in that how to grow and develop and become sustainable, are gratefully received. Thank you.
I think it was one sentence, just a very long one, Sharon. Thanks for all your work on this. As people have said, a very good report. I'm assuming we're happy to receive it with all the comments attached. Thank you. We resume at 11:10.
Thank you.
And could I ask presenter, the material we've read has to be repeated. Thank you.
Okay.
So demute. So I hope that gave you time to boil the kettle or pour the sherry, whatever is your wont and your part of the world. So we come back and you're going to give us feedback, Susanna, from the learning events. And I know there have been further big discussions. I think we'll all be coming in after you. So
I think so, yes. So I'm just going to very briefly, Ed unfortunately had to step away for something else. So I'm going to update on behalf of us both. So in May, we stood down the ICP meeting and invited ICP committee members, plus members of the Integrated Care Board and also Chairs Group and a number of other colleagues to join an away day on learning from the last winter, 2022-23. So we had a event which took place at Adastral Park. About 70 people attended that. And it included, I think it was 22 separate presentations. Those who were there saw me frantically waving a paper clock at people to keep them to time, but we just about managed it. But the big issue is that we shared that day as a system a huge wealth of data and information relating to the winter just past, which is really good food for thought in terms of how we might want to work going forward, both collectively in the different kind of collective and collaborative forums we've got in the system, but also individually in individual organisations as well. Thanks to my team for turning around the report of that event so quickly. So you have now a very comprehensive report of the proceedings that day. It's about 43 pages long. It contains a summary of each of the main presentations that you'd heard. It also contains some reflections from Shane and Wendy and Anna Crisp, who got together to kind of do a little bit of kind of collaborative reflections afterwards. And then also we used the Three Horizons thinking model that Mark Shenton introduced on the day to sort of summarise some of the thoughts that people captured during the day and some of the feedback we received afterwards. The big question now is, what do we do with this? And the reason why we wanted to make sure that make that report available to you as in such a timely fashion was so that you can take that report now and share that into whatever forum you think most appropriate. So the action proposed in the cover sheet you'll see today is that members of the ICP committee take that report, share it either with their individual organisational boards or collaborative forums, wherever most appropriate. And if you could just, I will prompt you all, if you could feedback in terms of actions and thinking that arises from that, I'll attempt to capture that and bring that back to the ICP when we meet again in August. So the report is there. It's available on our website, is in the domain, share away. And also I do know that some of the key colleagues who presented on that day, and we've got their individual slide decks and so on, are also really willing to support specific conversations as appropriate as well. So that's all, Chair.
That was a lovely phrase, share away. I immediately went to up and away, you're beautiful. But anyway, enough. Is Will back?
Yeah, Will's got his hand up and Nikki.
Will? Thank you, John, and thank you for that report, Susanna. And Mark has had to leave the meeting, as you know, with apologies because of another commitment. So he's asked me to give some feedback on his behalf as the chair of the Chairs Group on the away day. First of all, a really big thank you from the chairs for making the opportunity happen. Really appreciated. And I know the initial suggestion came from Helen in the chairs group, but actually then the work to make it happen was through the team, Susanna and colleagues, a wide range of colleagues, of course. So thank you to all. The day and the report, the day was excellent, the report is excellent. So really positive feedback from chairs group members there. I think there were three main reflections from chairs group members, which should be interesting, I think, for ICP committee members today. The chairs recognised that there were three challenges. First of all, not only three, of course, but three main challenges. And a very, very high level, how to stay strategic as well as being tactical at the same time was the first challenge that we all face. We all face it all the time, of course, but particularly in this issue. And then chairs group members particularly interested in ambulance response times and waits outside hospitals, of course, and then the 12-hour waits were all seen as critical. Couple of subsidiary items, well, they're not lesser importance, but also within chairs group discussions, it was really important that we manage staff well-being and that we minimise burnout. Otherwise, we'll, if you like, plan to fail. So that's really important. And that chairs group members were very keen that we as a system go further, go as far as we can, but go further than we have so far in admission avoidance, including in that local authority and council responsibilities to help ensure that the most vulnerable to admission get the right support and that they get that right support early. For example, only, of course, a wide range of, as John has referred to earlier, with the Robert Wood Johnson model and wider determinants of health, lots of issues, but of course, particularly warm homes for the winter coming up, getting vaccinated, really, really important. John, that's the feedback from the chairs group. I hope it's helpful, but the overall point is really supportive, and thanks to all for making it happen.
Yeah, I think, Will, for me, absolutely the piece. I'll make 2 points. Firstly, the other thing it does is debunk some myths that were going on last winter. Those of us in social care were feeling very bruised because apparently it was all our fault at one stage because the hospitals couldn't get people out, and while we were able to demonstrate both in Snee and across Essex that this was not the case, that was the piece. So having the evidence that it was a factor but not the factor is when you do.
It's all right, we've got it back.
Sorry. The art of brilliant management is when it isn't innovation or BAU. It's when you can take that leap change, which can be many small steps towards your desired agenda, in this case, as Will says, prevention, while at the same time coping with this. So let's not make it either or. Let's be the group that show how we can make it both and. I have Nikki, then Molly.
Thank you. I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, I really missed a brilliant event. It looks like there was some fantastic conversation, so I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there. So I just wanted to say something about how can we overtly ensure that there's a golden thread running through the work that we do in our sovereign organisations that links directly with the work that the ICS are doing as a partnership in terms of aspirations and priorities. And a couple of examples would be that in children and families in Essex, we continually work directly with children and families, focusing on their lived experience, seeking their feedback around how we can improve our service offer. So clearly there are opportunities to stretch this further into the work of the ICS and the local alliances. And another example would be the reference to focusing on inequalities. We have just launched our anti-racist strategy in children and families within Essex County Council. We're proud that we've launched it, but we recognise, and Councillor Beverly Egan is here today, who is the sponsor, but we recognise there's a long way to go and there's a lot of work to do. But there are opportunities, and Susanna alluded to it in terms of sharing the plans within our organisations. But I think we need to go, I think we can go much further than that as well in terms of that join up and that golden thread. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nikki. I'm just going to have to ask you to keep things tight, please. Molly, then Zephan, then Lucy, and I know there are more. Molly?
Just be very tight. I completely echo all those points around prevention, that we think about that all the time, not so that it's a boom and bust in the winter, but it's absolutely a much wider frame. And also to bring in that point around wider determinants. So in my role, we commission quite a lot of the warmer homes work. So again, that needs to happen all the year round to prepare people to make those sort of preventable admissions. So really just to think about that winter planning in as wide a scope as possible. And given the conversations we've had earlier about the VCFSE, what a crucial role they can play in some of that work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Zephan, Lucy, Myra?
Thank you, Chair. It was an excellent event, and I just wanted to give my compliments to those that organised it. Myself and Dr. Corrali, our medical director at EPUT, presented on the urgent care department that we've recently opened in Basildon. And what's fantastic and why I wanted to speak is that since then, we've had a number of really constructive conversations about how could we bring that service to North East Essex, how could we learn about that elsewhere. So I wanted to give the committee here that report that actually already since the event, there have been some really constructive actions taking things forward. And that's just one example. I know there are many others.
Very encouraging. Thank you. Lucy, Myra, Peter?
Well, Zeph's thankfully opened up the point that kind of wanted to make, which was actually, I love the summary at the end. I think that's really helpful because so much was covered during the day. And as Zeph says, it was a really good event. I think the bit for me is in the narrative, there's lots of what factors would or could. And actually, I think we need to be more directive in our system and say these are the things that we must do if we're actually going to make a difference. And Zeph said that, you know, some things have already started to change. Well, how are we going to monitor or communicate what things are changing as a result of this event? And how do we evaluate? I don't have to talk about inequalities as the DPH anymore because everybody else mentions it. But the thing for me now is how are we actually measuring whether what we're doing is making a difference? And how do we have some of those brave conversations about stopping what doesn't, rather than just keep layering different initiatives on top of each other? So I think for me, I'd like to come back to this at some point to talk about the real tangibles that Zeph talked about as an outcome, and then, you know, what impact that we then see within our populations.
Thank you, Lucy. That's a clear one for Susanna. We'll come back, Susanna, to you in a minute. I've got Myra, then Peter at the moment. Myra?
Thank you. I think the challenge with winter planning is getting that longer term plan, so we're making much better use of the capacity we've got in all the domains that people have been talking about, and really driving prevention of admission, both in that more longer term sense of prevention, but also in the moment. So the challenge, I think, is always that we tend to focus on winter and how we get the balance in terms of use of short-term funding, use of kind of surge planning, as against really embedding some of the things we need to do to change the system and people's experience. I think we're still quite organisationally focused rather than focused on the right pathway for individuals, and some other winter work historically, I think, has kind of encouraged us down that route. So it's actually getting people in the right place at the right time.
Thank you. Peter, and then that's my last hand at the moment. Then so back to Susanna. Peter?
So two brief points. Firstly, if you look at the patient comments in this sort of first couple of pages, 4 out of the 8 or 9 that are there are really around primary care and GPs. And I'm not sure we've got a dedicated section looking at primary care. There's bits around community, there's a bits around the wider bit, but I think we could strengthen the primary care bit by having a dedicated bit. I think it's important. And I apologise for my absence at the last meeting. I suspect people know why. The second part is just a plea for coherence. So the ICB is spending a lot of money and doing a lot of work around modelling, demand and capacity modelling in particular. And this looks to me like it's got some interesting numbers. So my questions are, do those numbers stack up with the demand and capacity modelling that we've done already? And do they fit coherently into that model that we're building for next winter? Because otherwise we're duplicating interventions and modelling.
Good point, Peter. Right, so Susanna?
So thank you everyone for the feedback on this, but I think what you've just demonstrated to me is that as much as we packed a lot into that day, we probably could have had a whole another day, both to kind of, include maybe some further content. I think you're quite right, Peter. Ruth did remind us on the day of the event that we could have had more in primary care. And also there was a huge appetite at the end of the day and subsequently to talk about what next. So it does feel as if we need a further product as a system following on from this. So the offer, if you like to say, look, let's take the report, let's now have some further conversations. You said not just, the report, but there are other ways to bring some of the specific features of what was shared that day into perhaps other forums. Peter, you might be able to suggest some for primary care and so on, and then to capture those collectively, so that we have got some really good collaborative planning mechanisms already obviously in the system. I mean, some of them are obvious, like our alliances and also the kind of One SNE program and so on, but also just to try and make sure that we don't let some of the other really important things slip off the table. So Molly and Lucy's points around the importance of prevention. We've now got the Equalities and Prevention Subcommittee as well. So I think the challenge is for us to continue this conversation. Suggested that we have this on the agenda for an update in August. John has just said to me, well, it might be that we need to spend a bit more time on this, perhaps in September, and to have a kind of, focus and make sure that the ICP owns that kind of collective ongoing action plan in terms of what we're doing as a whole system in response to winter pressures, or not just winter pressures, system pressures going forward this winter and beyond as well. So this will be coming back in August, and please, when I know I send you a lot of stuff, but if you could just make me aware of, so I could just try and share between you all of the different things going on, I'd be really grateful.
So it's a dilemma because Lucy to know what's made. There's no point in running the day if it doesn't make a difference. So I'll leave it to your judgment. At one level, August feels very early. At the other level, you can't leave it much later, can you? If it's going to make a difference next winter. So where you can all help, Susanna, here, is by voluntarily, and you could maybe set an action date for people to come back, say, by the end of June, mid-July, to explain on the different pieces what's been done, okay? What is being done, okay? And then you are invited to share this document with your... invited or commanded, Susanna?
Asked.
Asked to share this with your relevant organisation. So are we all okay on that? I will take that to be yes. Shane, we're coming over to you for the clinical priorities at ESNEFT, well above my level of work, Shane, but lovely to see you.
Thank you very much, John. I've got a lot of slides to get through in 20 minutes, so I'm aware there might not be a terribly long time for discussion at the end. I've put my email in the chat and would welcome feedback from any members on the draft strategy. In the next week would be brilliant because we are in the final run up to finalising that document. So if I may just share my screen with you, hopefully this will work.
What do you really want to get out of this? Because 20 minutes of slides just doesn't necessarily feel the best use of the time that we got here, because you're going to leave no time for inputs.
I think it's important to show the thinking behind the strategy, which is the intention today, and to invite comments on and reflection from the group, which I'll try to finish early enough to allow for some discussion, but there are quite a few bits to get through to get there.
Okay. All right, but I'll let you get on. I would invite you to consider whether absolutely all the slides need to be seen.
I'll absolutely do my best to do that. Thank you. So we are refreshing our clinical strategy at the Trust. We had a previous strategy set in 2019 that set our ambition to offer the best care and experience. It was founded on a philosophy that time matters, which I think resonates well with our staff and our patients, and our values of optimism, appreciation and kindness. We had 5 strategic objectives in that strategy, which I won't read out, but are listed here. And underneath them, you can see there are a huge number of strategic projects that have been delivered, many of those in partnership with your organisations in the system over the last 4 years, despite the fact, and some of them because of the pandemic. So I think that represents a huge amount of strategic change and delivery, despite the challenging circumstances that we've been under. We did set some measures of success in the last strategy. I think we did fairly well against the success measures that we set, not perfectly, but we did well on cancer performance, CQC in caring and well led, financial control and avoidance of regulatory action, which is always a good thing. There are some areas where we need to improve, which are particularly patient and staff experience, and of course the responsive domain, which looks at the main access standards that all hospital trusts are struggling with. So for our new strategy, we want to think very much about the new current and future context that we're working within. So that is the challenges within our communities, the opportunities that our organisation has, and again in partnership with other organisations in the system, and the particular challenges we're facing around the 3 priorities for the NHS in the immediate future, which are the familiar access standards for urgent emergency care, cancer and planned care. This will be familiar to all of you, which is the levels of deprivation that we were speaking about even earlier in this meeting in parts of our community, so particularly Tendring, but also Ipswich Town. Both those areas have 45,000 residents in each area living in the bottom 2 deciles of index of multiple deprivation. Really severe challenges. The big difference between those 2 areas is that in Ipswich it tends to be younger people living in high areas of high deprivation, and in Tendring it's older people, so there are slightly different challenges there, but really strong links. We've referenced the Robert Wood Johnson model a couple of times, but really strong links to comorbidities in this map, where you can see the alignment between the larger circles and the areas of deprivation, and in hard outcomes like life expectancy and cancer survival, where both Ipswich and particularly Tendring residents fare badly from those outcomes. And some of the reasons for that are exactly the sort of things we were talking about earlier in terms of infrastructure and access to services. So if you are living in Tendring and you get your appointment in Colchester for your breast screening and you can't afford the £16 round trip on public transport and you don't have access to your own car, how are you going to get there? You may not, and therefore you may miss the opportunity for a good outcome if you did have cancer. So those sort of things are really, really important, and we can make a difference collectively to the factors that influence those outcomes. So some of the conversation earlier about locality plans, I think, is something we are buying into very strongly in our strategy for ESNEFT. We've also got to recognise the growth in the population in our communities. So on the right-hand side, this is since 2010 right the way through to the end of the ONS forecast in 2043, showing Colchester as the fastest growing local authority in the east of England. It's actually the fastest growing local authority in England in that entire period. That is adding 55,000 residents to the Colchester population over 30 years. That's the equivalent of the entire population of Bury St Edmunds moving in. That's a huge increase in population there. Tendring is also growing strongly. It's not to say there isn't growth around East Ipswich and East Suffolk. There is, and indeed West Suffolk, but it's more moderate than it is in North East Essex. But in all areas, the growth, particularly in the over 85s, which again is very familiar to you. And the importance of that, of course, that as we age, we collect chronic diseases like football stickers, and therefore are more complex and need more care and intervention. For the trust, we've got to make sure we leverage the scale of the trust to provide sustainable, high-quality services for our patients. So last year, we undertook 1.25 million outpatient appointments. That is 1.5 times our total population, and hundreds of thousands of other types of more complex activity. But I think what that says the message particularly we're sending back into the organisation is how important those many opportunities in outpatient and community care are as points of intervention for those wider determinants of health. So making every contact count as an example of different approaches to doing that. Recognition that our workforce is ageing in line with our population, and this demographic age band chart up here showing the shift between 2020 in the blue and 2030 in the orange, that we are gaining older age population and workforce and losing working age population and therefore workforce over that period, gives us a triple whammy. So more people needing care, fewer people available to be the workforce to provide it, but also fewer taxpayers to pay for it. So I think that's a challenge we're all facing in this next 10 years. And you can see in our divisions significant proportions of our workforce already approaching retirement age. So that says to me the focus on skill mix, on international recruitment, on developing training and education and recruitment pipelines locally as part of our anchor organisation work, and the use of technology are really critical to our future success. Urgent and emergency care, I think this is perhaps the most severe challenge that we're facing, is bed occupancy, and it continues to be at the moment. So this is the Colchester bed occupancy chart over the last full financial year, and the yellow line is the maximum safe occupancy as stated by the Department of Health and Social Care at 92%. We haven't seen that level of occupancy for the whole of last year, and indeed for most of last year we've been above our total adult bed base in terms of the number of patients in beds, even up to 120% of our normal adult bed base. And this creates all sorts of problems. It's unsafe in terms of patient care. We are not geared up to care for people routinely in corridors, outpatient departments, day surgery units, and yet we are. And of course, that gets in the way of everything else that we need to do as a trust to serve you and your friends, families and communities. So this is a really serious problem for us. One of the issues may be that we just don't have enough beds. It's not the only issue by a long way, but England has the lowest beds of all the OECD countries in Europe, other than Sweden, which has the best primary care in Europe, bar none, for the last 20 years. In the east of England, we have 1.7 beds per thousand population, even lower than that England average, and in SNE, it's 1.6. So we have a really, really low bed base for our population. That is part of the problem. The other issues, though, I think are more subtle and came out in some of the winter discussions earlier. So if you ask the questions, why have we got more people in beds? You could have an assumption that it's more people coming in by ambulance, but that doesn't stack up when you look at the data. We've got fewer ambulances coming into both hospitals than we did in 2017. Fewer ambulances, but we have got more over 65s coming in by ambulance. We also are admitting either the same in Colchester or fewer people than we did in 2017 in Ipswich. So it's not more people coming in, it's not more people being admitted, but the people coming in are sicker. So ambulance category 1 call-outs have gone up 40% since the pandemic. That's people who've stopped breathing or their hearts have stopped. That is a dramatic increase. When we look at the complexity of patients' comorbidities in the hospital and the complexity of the treatment codes that we assign to them for data collection, they are more complex by somewhere between 11 and 15% than they were in 2019. So there's a real shift in the complexity of patients that we're seeing. Other factors include the number of stranded patients that we've got in the hospital as people staying over 7 days length of stay, where we are mid-table nationally. Not dreadful, but there are a significant number of areas in the country that have lower levels of people who take longer to get home. And I think that's part of what you were saying earlier, Chairman, about the complexity of that as a challenge for us as a system. So that's part of the issue. In cancer, we've seen a 300% increase in the number of cancer referrals from primary care since 2018. Now, that's particularly in 3 tumour sites, so that's skin, lower GI and breast. Skin is the only tumour site where cancer incidence is actually going up. So I've heard people say that it's a bad thing that GPs are referring in more 2-week waits. But when you look at the proportion of cancers that are diagnosed each quarter, actually that's doubled over the same period. So if we're not missing more cancers, that suggests we're picking them up earlier, and therefore that may be a good thing. But it means our services have got to adapt to the higher rate of 2-week wait referrals, and they're not geared up for that at the moment. So that's a challenge we've got to meet. And then in planned care, we've got significant reductions in follow-up that's been done over the last few years, nearly 20% reduction in the follow-up ratio, but we haven't increased the first capacity at all. So that effort and activity has gone into other things. We've got 3 specialties, ear, nose and throat, ophthalmology and trauma and orthopaedics, where waiting lists are going up rather than down. So where does that leave us? Well, we've looked at the structure of our strategy. And what we're proposing is that our ambition to offer the best care and experience needs an amendment to recognise the importance of equity in health outcomes. So we need to adapt that. Our philosophy of time matters still seems very relevant. It's a very good tool for change and conversation with our staff as well as our patients. Our values seem to be well recognised and resonate within the Trust, and we have validated the strategic objectives against the current challenges, and they still seem to fit very well. Where the effort will go in, I think, is in the key strategic initiatives that underlie that. So we have a number here that are available in your pack, and I won't go through them in great detail, but really would value your feedback, particularly on whether we've missed key initiatives that ought to be in here that will help us to deliver our part in the outcomes for the system. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think you did less than 20 minutes actually, so well done. It's fascinating actually, and I've just leant over to Will beside me here and said, wouldn't it be fascinating to see how that is replicated across the whole of my county, as I'm sure Suffolk colleagues would agree for Suffolk. So a very early hand went up from Ruth.
Hi, thank you, Shane. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there, and really appreciate all the hard work, and we're very well presented. I just do have a few points, as you'd expect. So on the maps, I think we need to be really careful we don't ignore North East Coastal. It isn't as dark red as all the other areas, but it's further away. And my concern is that by focusing always on Ipswich, Tendring, and those areas, that East Suffolk is also growing, as your slide showed, and they're getting older, and it's much more difficult for them to get to Ipswich. So if we don't do something about that to stop that slide, we could end up with a real problem in North East Coastal. So it might be worth just amending your slide so that North East Coastal or that coastal part of Suffolk is highlighted particularly. So I very much appreciate your work on your comments on leading the integration of care. I'd just be careful about leading. I'm not sure I want you to be leading that, but sharing the leadership of that integration of care, because my experience of working on the UTC is there's a lot of parallel clinical pathways being worked up, and a lot of work that's been either duplicated or not actually that impacts primary care or ED without any discussion, and sometimes those ideas clash, as I'm sure you're aware, but there's real opportunities there, and there's also real opportunities for working with the VCFSE. And I think going back to the earlier presentations, let's get in there early. I've got 2 examples. I see Romanian patients seeking healthcare in ED. It's cultural. That's what you do in Romania. And I am well aware they're not getting. There's a difference in their the healthcare that we're providing for that group. That is just one area, but it's obvious, and actually as an ICP, I think that's one that we could tackle and use as a pilot. And the other thing is the opportunities for transport. The Our community, for example, in Fram, and the work they're doing to try and avoid the DNAs. And one final point, there's loads of other examples, I'm sure, by the way. One final point on the cancer, we've done a dermatology pilot with the North East Coastal and Woodbridge PCNs, and the quality of dermatology referrals into the 2-week wait was shown to be extremely impressive in that they were all biopsied, which meant they were all potentially suspicious. Unfortunately, we've not been given any funding to take that wider, and I think when we've got things that work, it's a shame that as a system we don't grasp those. And I'll breathe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Very comprehensive. I'm afraid we can't take loads of contributions like that. We have 3 items still to do, but it's Peter, Will, Judy, Lucy. Peter?
Yeah, Shane, really interesting presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it, actually. A couple of points. We seem to be still stuck in the single disease clinic outpatient model. Does the Trust have any thoughts about moving to a generalist polymorbidity type model across outpatients and, for that matter, inpatients? Because that seems to be part of the solution to the increasing complexity. Does the Trust have any thoughts about clinical prioritisation of waiting lists, which is a really difficult nut to crack, and how we manage that going forward? And on the skin analytics and 2-week rate dermatology, there's a massive opportunity in digital, which I'm sure the Trust is appraised of, but actually, you know, that's the sort of capacity adding technology that really helps everybody. So look for support on that. And lastly, it's a bit of a poison chalice, but how do we square that circle? You intimated in your presentation that we're low on hospital beds, we need more, I would agree, but how do we do that within a fixed budgetary envelope without paralysing the rest of the system?
Okay,
thank you.
Shane, I was going to come to you at the end, but you've had about 11 points already, so could you just give some very brief response to those?
Yes, well, all good points, which I'll try to reflect in the document as we develop it. I don't think I can go further than that at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a bit the easiest thing. That if you take this as a chance to have all the intakes, you can always send a note round the attendance afterwards, just giving some key answers. Will, Judy, Lucy?
Thanks, John. And these are on behalf of Mark, who's had to leave the meeting, as you know. 3 points. First of all, Shane, could you ensure that the strategy is joined up with the emerging primary care strategy? And secondly, could you make sure that the strategy is inclusive, excuse me, of the ideas and input from clinical directors and medical directors of federations and also mental health colleagues? And then thirdly, and actually Zephan touched on this point earlier, Mark would like to ask the question very specifically: how can we get a mental health ED like Basildon at West Suffolk and at Colchester/Ipswich? But of course, Zephan touched on that earlier, but a very specific request from Mark there. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy?
Thank you, Shane. Really interesting piece. Please do come and talk to us at St Elizabeth Hospice. We're also just about to redo our strategy as well, so it's really good timing. And a plea, really, the out of hospital project that we're co-funding together, the virtual wards, there's still more we can do there. So we know the discharges are going really well in terms of getting our 18 beds used well, but there's a lot more we can do in the community through that virtual ward model. And I'd love to talk to you about it more, Shane. So we want that 3-year project to be a real success. It makes a massive difference. Thank you.
I'll come and see you, Judy.
All for that, Judy. Lucy?
Very quick one. Shane, I think it's hugely refreshing that you are looking through a multitude of lenses at this clinical strategy. And although I take on board Peter's points about different approaches and not just kind of specialty led. I do think this is a much more holistic plan than we've seen previously from acute sector community providers. So the only thing I'd ask is that you drop me a line offline, because there is that focused growth in North East Essex, and I'm really interested in how we can support with public health and MEC with regard to outpatients, but also thinking about some of those wider preventative and waiting well initiatives. I just think it would be helpful if we were closer on that.
Will do, thank you.
And then very briefly, if you don't mind, Nikki, then Stefan, and then I'll come back to you, Shane.
Thank
Nikki.
you. Just 2 quick points, and recognising the huge challenges and complexities, Shane, that you've shared today. I'm sure there's many things that sit behind this, but my first point was, is there a prioritisation of those initiatives in terms of delivery, goals to be achieved, and timescales that actually sits behind this? Because obviously everything is there together, and I just wondered how you've broken that down. And secondly, I was just unclear in terms of SNF leading the development of the integrated neighbourhood teams in North East Essex, because obviously I sit on the Alliance as well, and we've already gone live with 3 of those neighbourhood teams, which is led by the Alliance and a multi-agency partnership steering group. So I was just unclear about how SNF are leading that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, so just on that last point, if I may, we're not leading it, but I think it falls into our commitment to integration of care. Is to support that.
Stefan?
Thanks. Great presentation, Shane. Really like the analytical grounding that set out the case for change. Key thing for me that would be really nice to draw out is the role of SNF as an anchor institution, and the impact you can have locally across all of the geography as an employer as well. Kind of building on some of what colleagues have said, really strengthening the ambition around alliances and how going to work with all partners. I think that would be excellent. And then for me personally, calling out that commitment which you did make about the integration, and for me there's 3 dimensions to that: integration between health and social care, primary and secondary, and mental and physical health, and of course the voluntary sector as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now, Susanna's just whispered to me that she will work with you, Shane, to produce an answers document next week for circulation to everybody. So with that grateful news that you've got a piece of work to do, anything you want to say is the final word?
No, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this and shape its development.
Well, thank you for inspiring such active engagements, actually, Shane. Well done. Right, so we come to Susanna on Expo.
So I am going to be 10 seconds just to say that everybody knows that this is on Friday the 7th of July. So this is the July meeting of the Integrated Care Partnership. The agenda will include a formal meeting of the ICP. It will be in the afternoon. It will be short, but we're encouraging you to spend the whole day there. If anybody needs space for any other side meeting that you would need to have during the day to have you there on site, we can arrange that. So you just need to let my team know. I will write to you to everybody next week with an update on the programme, and we'll be releasing the programme, actually the full programme, probably about 2 weeks beforehand. That will be next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we come to the 2 AOBs that I've agreed to. Leighton Hammett from Essex Police about the Essex, what's it called? Data sharing declaration. Leighton.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nearly afternoon. You'll be pleased to know I haven't got any slides. The ECTA, Essex Centre of Data Analytics, isn't something that I lead on or work in, but I am really passionate about. Nicola Mallet should have been here today, but because of agenda hiccups, she isn't, so you've got me. But the reason for me coming today to talk to you about this is because I can see real value in it. And before I start, we've obviously got the Suffolk Office of Data Analytics as well. So for people here solely from the Suffolk side, there is a very similar thing to the Essex Centre of Data Analytics that's trying to achieve the same thing. So when I'm talking about this, if you're not a member of that, you may want to consider for your organisation taking part. So I'm supposed to reference it into how important it is here. I'll just go back to Shane's presentation. You saw all of the data on there, and Shane, it was really impressive to kind of understand from where you sit what's driving the need for the hospital. How great would that be if that was to start to be overlaid with what the place element of data, which generating some of these repeated needs, so community-based intelligence and information from the community safety network and others to then understand what we could do within a place to prevent the amount of hospital admissions that you get. And that's really what the Essex Centre of Data and Analytics is about. It's about getting organisations together to start to share data better. So at the Essex Health and Wellbeing Board in July, our Chief Constable is going to come and talk about the data declaration. And it's just to really explain it to partners here today so you can consider joining up. So the data declaration is really a strategic commitment from an organisation from the executive level to say that we are going to be lawfully audacious with our data. We're going to share it within the law, but we're going to share it to support the wider system's priorities. That's the first part, and we've got a lot of organisations already joined up, but many more that could come in on the journey. But the second part then is to go back and talk within your respective organisations and to your data guardians, so your data protection teams, and explain what it means, because ECTA's done some really great work, but it's also had a few bumps in the road where it's gone into organisations where there's got that strategic direction, but the data guardians are still nervous about sharing data. So my plea today, and I'm going to put an email address in the chat bar, is to go away and talk within your organisations and see if this is something that you would like to support. All of the stuff that we've discussed today, where we're looking at need and trying to understand and get ahead of a problem, being more informed about it, I think will make a huge difference. And there is a lot of outside organisations like the police and other bodies in the Integrated Care Partnership and the wider community safety team that hold information that can really help unlock this, but also unlock similar priorities. So an example would be a community safety team locally based, looking to identify vulnerability from a crime prevention point of view, but the same people they're talking about are vulnerable and probably got a huge footprint across social care and health. And it's about how do we manage them interactions and make sure that they're meaningful for more than one agency. So I'll leave it there because I'm not the subject matter expert, but I do absolutely see the value in it. I'll put the website address in the chat bar, and you've been forwarded the papers by Susanna to read. And I'll happily put you in touch with Nikki Mallet or Fiona Henderson to discuss it further if you wanted to have any more questions around it. But it was just to whet the appetite and try to get some more buying. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Leighton. And in talking about this internally in the last few days, people have been paying tribute to the SUDA in Suffolk and telling me that actually the Suffolk model's well advanced on the Essex. So when you go back to the Chief Constable, when he comes to the Health and Wellbeing Board in July, I'd be grateful if BJ might just compare where we are with Suffolk and see what we can learn from that county. And there must be people, Susanna, who can help us learn. So, okay, Leighton?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're quite fortunate that Fiona Henderson, who was in Suffolk Police, has come over to Essex Police and was involved in SODA. So we've got that transfer across. Plus, we can use existing relationships here, can't we, to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. And very finally, one more. Susanna?
Okay, so I took any other business. I wrote to you all yesterday with an email that says important at the beginning. So the clues in the title. What that says is that we've received some correspondence from the Care Quality Commission. They will begin their formal process of inspecting integrated care systems. So when they inspect an integrated care system, it's not just the Integrated Care Board, it's the system partners. So it would be an inspection of really, the partners in the system as well as the Integrated Care Board. They're going to start those formal inspections in 2024. What they're looking for are 2 pilot sites. They can pilot the methodology that they're developing for integrated care system assessments. And those pilot assessments would take place, one in September and one in December this year. We're thinking about putting forward an expression of interest for Suffolk and North East Essex to be one of those 2 pilot sites. So I wrote to you all yesterday just to ask for your views on us submitting that expression of interest. I'd like those as soon as possible, please, but certainly by the 15th next week so that we can have a look at those and then take a decision on whether or not to put that EOI in before the deadline of the 21st of June. So thank you.
Thank you. And while all partners are equal, it's particularly important to hear from those for whom this will involve significant work. And you know, Susanna, that I will be guided by officers, but I'm very thoughtful as to whether we just got the capacity. That's all. We are going to be inspected 7 times in Essex under the new CQC regime. So there we go. Now, I have no questions from the public. I have no questions on live streaming.
No.
We're going to have to say bye-bye. We're going to have to pull ourselves apart and go and enjoy the rest of the day in the knowledge of a gloriously sunny but maybe thundery weekend to come. Apologies that poor chairmanship has again gone past midday, so I'm sorry. But thank you all very much for a very good active participation. I really liked the meeting. Thanks for all you're doing, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a lovely weekend.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
For the sin.
Hi, John. Hi, Will.
Yeah, it's just hopeless.